Hello, my friends. I want to return to the main thread of what happened yesterday in Moscow because it is far more consequential than most Western commentary is willing to admit, and it has direct implications not only for Ukraine, but for the Middle East, for the relationship between Russia and the United States, and for the increasingly uneasy mood inside Europe as well. After a long absence from the day-to-day media cycle, President Vladimir Putin came back to center stage with a major foreign policy statement, and in my judgment, it marks a visible hardening of Russia's public position on the Ukraine war. If you take his words seriously, if you take them at face value, then what many people in the West like to call a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Ukraine is now significantly harder to achieve than it looked even a few weeks or months ago. In fact, I will go further. The way Western officials talk about peace talks is increasingly detached from what Russia is now openly signaling it will accept, and that gap is widening, not narrowing. Putin spoke about Ukraine in broad, systemic terms, tying the conflict to the deterioration of international relations and the long-running refusal of the West to treat Russia's security interests as legitimate. He said very clearly that the crisis around Ukraine became a direct consequence of years of ignoring Russia's legitimate interests and of a deliberate policy of creating threats to Russia's security, including NATO's advance toward Russia's borders, contrary to public promises made to Russia. He then reminded everyone that Russia has repeatedly put forward initiatives to build what he called a new, reliable, and fair architecture of European and global security. He said Russia has proposed rational options that would satisfy everyone in Europe, Asia, America, and across the world. And then he made the pivotal point. Russia believes it would be worthwhile to return to a substantive discussion of these proposals to establish the conditions under which a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine could be achieved, and the sooner the better. He added that Russia strives for a long-term and sustainable peace that reliably ensures the security of all. He acknowledged that not everyone, neither in Kiev nor in the capitals that back it, is ready for this, but he expressed hope that awareness of this necessity will come sooner or later. And until then, he said, Russia will continue to consistently pursue its objectives. Now, this is where Western reporting has either failed to read carefully or has chosen to blur what was said. Many outlets have paraphrased Putin as if he said, "We need peace in Ukraine as soon as possible." But that is not what the logic of his statement implies. What he actually did was reframe the meaning of peace away from the narrow, Ukraine-only conversation, away from bargaining over lines on a map or a ceasefire or a package of security guarantees for Ukraine, and toward a broader, structural negotiation over the European security order itself. In other words, Putin is not saying, let's isolate Ukraine and sign a quick deal. He is saying, if you want a durable peace, if you want something that reliably ensures the security of everyone, then you must address the security architecture of Europe. You must go back to the proposals Russia has already put on the table in the past. And only under those conditions, only after that broader architecture is addressed, can a peaceful settlement in Ukraine be achieved. It is not difficult to identify what proposals he was referring to, because Russia has two very specific documents that fit exactly this description. The two draft treaties presented in December 2021 to the United States and to NATO. Those drafts were rejected at the time, almost outright, by Washington and by the alliance. And what did those drafts demand? They demanded an end to further NATO expansion eastward, no Ukraine, no Moldova, no Caucasus, no more movement toward Russia's borders. They also demanded dismantling the NATO military infrastructure that had been built in Eastern Europe after the expansion process began. Bases, logistics, forward deployments, the whole framework of post-1998 expansion. In effect, what Russia sought was a rollback to the posture that existed before NATO expansion, meaning NATO's military footprint and infrastructure would withdraw back toward Germany, and in practical terms, toward the old Cold War boundary. This is an extraordinary demand when viewed through the lens of Western political reality, because it requires the West to admit that the post-Cold War security order in Europe was built on broken promises and strategic overreach. And it is also an extraordinary demand because, if we are being realistic, it is nearly impossible to imagine the United States Senate ratifying any treaty that commits Washington to a wholesale retreat of its forces and infrastructure from Eastern Europe. It is not just unlikely, it is structurally improbable given the composition of American politics, the ideology of American primacy, the entrenched hostility to Russia, and the fact that the entire American political class has spent years telling its public that NATO expansion is non-negotiable and that Russia must be contained. Even if you imagine different election outcomes, the U.S. system is not designed to deliver this kind of strategic concession, not to a Russia led by Putin, and not to any Russian leadership that follows his line. So what happens when Putin ties Ukraine peace to a demand Washington cannot grant? This is where the hardening becomes unmistakable. Putin is effectively saying a long-term peace in Ukraine is contingent on redoing the European security order and reversing the consequences of NATO expansion. He is saying the negotiations that should begin as soon as possible are not negotiations about a quick Ukraine ceasefire. They are negotiations about rolling back NATO's military posture and reconstructing security arrangements in Europe. And if that does not happen, if the West refuses, then Russia will consistently pursue its objectives. In the real world, that means Russia continues the war until those objectives are achieved by force or until the cost imposed on the West becomes so great that Western leaders finally accept that they must negotiate on Russia's terms. This is not a theatrical ultimatum, but it is a strategic warning backed by battlefield momentum. It is worth remembering that when the draft treaties were discussed in late 2021 and early 2022, Russian officials openly said that if the West rejected the proposals, Russia would resort to what they called military technical measures. This was not hidden. This was stated. One can argue, and it is not an unreasonable argument, that Russia has been pursuing that logic all along. Use military pressure to compel the West to acknowledge Russia's security red lines. Of course, Ukraine itself matters. Territory, neutrality, non-alignment. The size and posture of Ukraine's military, these were at the heart of the Istanbul discussions in April 2022 and remain central to any settlement. But Putin is now saying, in public, that the Ukraine settlement cannot be separated from the broader NATO question. That is the hardening. That is the shift. Russia's demands now openly extend beyond Ukraine and into the structure of Europe's security system itself. Now consider what this does to the parade of Western plans that keep circulating. We've heard talk of special envoys, stacks of points, packages of guarantees, phased ceasefires, and proposals cooked up in Washington, Kiev, and various European capitals. We also hear that American envoys may go to Moscow soon with yet another set of documents. But if Putin has now made this reframing explicit, then a Western delegation arriving in Moscow to talk about Istanbul Plus, or about Ukrainian security guarantees, or about how Ukraine might withdraw here or there, will hit a wall. Putin's response, if his speech is taken seriously, will be, "You are not here to negotiate security guarantees for Ukraine. You are here to negotiate the security architecture of Europe. Ukraine's future security can only be discussed inside that framework. If you cannot discuss that, then there is nothing to talk about, and Russia will continue the operation." And this brings us to the European reaction, which I suspect is already being shaped by what the Americans have been hearing privately from the Russians. My own strong suspicion is that Russia has been communicating this position to Washington for some time now, probably since the new year, and that it is precisely this message that has triggered the sudden, nervous interest inside Europe in talking to Russia, and even in appointing some kind of European negotiator. Europe is starting to realize that if the US and Russia begin serious talks about Europe's security architecture, and Europe is not at the table, then Europe will not be shaping the outcome. Europe will be the object of the outcome. In plain language, Europe fears being treated not as a participant, but as a bargaining chip. That is why you now see European leaders shifting tone. You hear people in Paris and Rome suddenly talking about dialogue. You even see unusual tonal shifts in Berlin. When German leadership suddenly says, in effect, Russia is a European country, we must eventually stabilize relations, that is not radical in terms of geography or history, but it is a radical shift compared to the rigid moralistic posture Europe has adopted since 2022. It reflects anxiety. It reflects fear that Ukraine is collapsing, that Russia is advancing, and that Washington may decide to negotiate directly with Moscow in ways that leave European interests exposed. And Europe's fear is not just about Russia. It is also about the United States. European elites are alarmed by the increasingly blunt American rhetoric about spheres of influence, about the Western Hemisphere, about might makes right logic creeping back into open discourse, and about demands that disregard European sensibilities. When America speaks as if force is the final arbiter and treaties are optional, European leaders begin to wonder whether they can rely on Washington's protection or whether Washington will trade their interests away in a deal that serves America first. The Europeans are looking at Ukraine and seeing the reality: Ukrainian cities in blackout, energy infrastructure collapsing, economic activity grinding down, morale fraying, and a humanitarian catastrophe looming in sub-zero temperatures. They can see that Ukraine is being ground down from the sky and from the front. They can see that the Russian military has the initiative, and they are starting to realize that continuing to pretend otherwise is suicidal policy. That battlefield reality is the foundation of Putin's confidence. Ukraine's blackout conditions are not just a talking point, they are the material basis for collapse. When power grids fail, water systems fail, heating fails, transport fails, industry fails, hospitals struggle, governance strains, and the economy becomes impossible to sustain. Under these conditions, a state does not win. It survives day to day until it cannot. Russian air power and missile power have been applied relentlessly, and even Western reporting that tries to dress it up cannot hide the overall picture. Ukraine's infrastructure is being systematically degraded in a way that makes long-term resistance enormously difficult. This is not just tactical, it is strategic. It is about breaking the state's capacity to function. In parallel with Putin's speech, we saw important signals from the Russian military command. Russian reporting showed Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov visiting the headquarters of Group of Forces Center, which has been one of the most aggressive and powerful Russian formations on the battlefield, associated with major advances and key captures. Gerasimov stated that Russian forces continue to advance along the front, that buffer zones are being extended in border regions, and he spoke with confidence about battles nearing conclusion in contested sectors. On some points, Ukrainian sources dispute Russian claims. And it is true that we do not have independent observers on every street corner. Drone footage can be manipulated, both sides have engaged in information warfare. But the strategic direction is clear. Russia is the side with operational momentum, Russia is the side pressing forward, and Russia is the side imposing catastrophic effects from the sky. What struck me most, however, was not only what Gerasimov said, but what Russian media chose to show. There was footage of what appeared to be a planning session, officers clustered around maps, Gerasimov marking a map with a marker, an atmosphere of intense operational preparation, and the audio was removed. That is an unusual choice, because even without sound, lips move. Any serious intelligence service has lip-reading specialists or access to them. So why publish the footage? Either Russia is genuinely preparing a major blow in that sector and no longer cares if Western intelligence suspects it because Ukraine cannot stop it anyway, or Russia is conducting an exercise in misdirection, focusing Western attention on one area while preparing to strike elsewhere. My instinct leans toward the first. Russia is signaling confidence. Russia is telling the West, implicitly, look at what we are preparing. You cannot stop it. You should negotiate if you want to avoid what comes next. This is also why the West's obsession with security guarantees for Ukraine looks increasingly detached from reality. The West wants guarantees that lock Ukraine into a Western security framework. Russia sees that as a direct continuation of the threat that caused this war in the first place. As Russia's battlefield position strengthens, Russia's willingness to entertain Western framing decreases. That is how wars work. The stronger side hardens its terms because it believes it can impose them. And Putin's speech sounded like a leader whose state believes victory is within reach. Now, Putin did not confine himself to Ukraine. He also delivered a pointed rebuke without naming names toward the United States and its recent behavior. He criticized unilateral and dangerous actions that substitute for diplomacy, the might makes right principle used to impose narratives and issue orders, and the way weaker states suffer infringements of sovereignty, chaos, and lawlessness because they lack the strength to defend themselves. The target of these remarks is not mysterious. It reflects Russia's broader indictment of American conduct, the belief that Washington uses power as a substitute for law, that it treats international rules as optional, and that it cloaks coercion in moral language. The most revealing word Putin used in that section was sincerely. He said Russia is sincerely committed to the ideals of a multipolar world. That word is not accidental. It implies that someone else is not sincere. Someone else talks about multipolarity while acting like an empire. If multipolarity is real, then international law, diplomacy, balance, and respect for other great powers must be real too. A state that embraces might makes right while claiming to accept a multipolar order is lying. Putin's message is that Russia means multipolarity in the serious sense, not as a rebranding of domination. Then Putin spoke about Cuba, and again, Western commentary will miss this unless it pays attention. Cuba's ambassador was presenting credentials, and Putin used the moment to underscore that Russia and Cuba enjoy strong and friendly relations, that Russia has consistently provided assistance and support, and that Russia stands in solidarity with Cuba's determination to defend sovereignty and independence. He referred to the Russian-Cuban alliance as having withstood the test of time and being rooted in sincere mutual goodwill between their peoples. Those are unusually warm words in diplomatic language, and the word alliance matters. Russia does not hand that label out casually. Cuba is not simply a trade partner, it is a historically significant relationship that Moscow still treats as strategic. And when Putin highlights it in the context of recent threats made against Cuba by American leaders, he is signaling a red line. He is reminding Washington that Russia is watching, that Cuba is not alone, and that Moscow is prepared to stand by its ally. This also intersects with the practical issue of Cuba's energy needs. Cuba is short of oil. It needs stable supply to keep its economy functioning. Some in the West say Russia won't help because Cuba can't pay. That is simplistic. Putin's language emphasizes assistance, not merely commerce. And the material reality is that Russia can supply Cuba with the oil it needs without it being a major strain, especially relative to the scale of Russia's energy exports. Unless Washington attempts a full blockade, which would be an extremely dangerous escalation, Cuba has options. The deeper problem, in my view, is that Cuba has hesitated too long to lean on friends for support at scale. Putin's speech reads like an invitation. You are an ally. We have supported you before. We can support you again. Now, shift to the Middle East, where we see something else that matters. Putin conducted calls with Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I do not believe these were the only contacts between Moscow and these capitals. I suspect there has been extensive diplomatic traffic behind the scenes, and likely with Washington as well, because the Middle East crisis triggered by the protests in Iran has been a major international flashpoint. The readouts from Moscow are careful but revealing. In the call with Pezeshkian, Iran briefed Putin on efforts to normalize the situation. Both sides affirmed support for de-escalation and for resolving issues exclusively through political and diplomatic means. They reaffirmed commitment to strengthening the strategic partnership and implementing joint economic projects. In the call with Netanyahu, Putin emphasized stepping up political and diplomatic efforts to ensure stability and security. And then came the key phrase. Russia confirmed its commitment to continuing mediation efforts and to promoting constructive dialogue among all concerned parties, and they agreed to maintain contacts at various levels. If Russia is continuing mediation efforts, that is effectively a confirmation that Russia has already been acting as a mediator in this crisis. And this matches what I have been saying. The shadow of Moscow has fallen over the Middle East situation in a way that Western audiences do not fully grasp. Russia is not merely commenting from the sidelines. Russia is shaping outcomes. Russia has the relationships, the credibility with key actors, and the strategic interest in preventing an uncontrolled escalation that could trigger a larger war or invite direct American strikes. In my view, Russia's role has been decisive in two ways. First, on the operational side, Iran's ability to suppress and neutralize the protest movement depended heavily on disrupting communications and coordination. There has been discussion that Russian technology and know-how were involved in jamming and neutralizing systems that protesters relied on. I cannot independently verify every named piece of equipment being circulated online, and I am not going to pretend I can. But as a general proposition, Russia possesses exactly the type of electronic warfare capabilities that could make a difference in such circumstances, and it is reasonable to believe Moscow assisted Tehran. Second, on the strategic side, the expected American strike on Iran, widely discussed, reportedly prepared, and then not executed, suggests deterrence and diplomacy intervened. Plans can remain on the shelf. A carrier group moving toward the Persian Gulf shows that the crisis is not over. But the immediate strike did not happen when many expected it. That points toward behind-the-scenes restraint, and Russia is one of the few actors with both the motive and the ability to influence that outcome. So, when you put all of this together, Putin's reframing of Ukraine peace as inseparable from Europe's security architecture, Gerasimov's signaling of operational preparation and confidence, Europe's sudden anxiety and talk of dialogue, Putin's red-line language on Cuba, and Russia's mediation posture in the Middle East, you see one coherent strategic picture. Russia is widening the political and diplomatic battlefield beyond Ukraine. Russia is saying Ukraine is the symptom, not the cause. The cause is the post-Cold War security order that the West imposed while ignoring promises and pushing military infrastructure to Russia's borders. Russia is now strong enough on the battlefield to force that issue. And unless the West is prepared to talk about the larger structure NATO expansion, deployments, the rollback of the post-1998 military footprint, then Russia will continue to pursue its objectives by force until the West is compelled to accept what it has refused to accept for decades. This is why the next round of Western peace plans may collide with a Russian agenda that has moved beyond what Washington and Brussels are psychologically prepared to discuss. The West wants to treat Ukraine as a contained problem. Russia is insisting it is a European security problem. The West wants guarantees for Ukraine. Russia wants guarantees against the West. The West wants to preserve the post-1992 order. Russia is openly signaling it wants that order renegotiated and partially reversed. And Russia is speaking from a position of growing military leverage, not from weakness. That is the reality. Whether Western capitals like it or not, the conflict is heading toward a confrontation over the architecture of European security itself. And Russia is now telling the world calmly, firmly, and with increasing confidence that it intends to shape that architecture on its own terms.